And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we're going to continue looking at the aggregate expenditure model. And we're actually going to draw a graph now. On the previous podcast, we were looking at the multiplier effect and how the multiplier effect worked through this formula down here, where we looked at the change in initial spending and how through the multiplier effect that would change the income or gross domestic product of the country. And so what we found was that the change in initial spending would lead to a much bigger change in the income or the gross domestic product. And so what this really means is that, well, let's before we get into what this really means, let's draw a picture of what this looks like. So this connection is known as the consumption function. This is the consumption function. So if we think about the consumption function here for a second, we have our formula of y equals c plus ig, and now we're going to add to that. I'm not going to write it this way every time, but just for now, just to see it, what we really mean to say here is y equals c, which is a function of income plus gross investment. So this is what we saw on the previous video, where we saw an increase in consumption would of course cause an increase in income because there's an equal sign here. So if this side goes up, this side has to go up. But then if y goes up through the multiplier effect, that causes c to go up. And then if c goes up, that causes y to go up again. But if y went up, that causes c to go up. And off we go through this multiplier effect thing. Now, this connection is made through the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume, so I don't have to write it, I have it up here. The marginal propensity to consume is the change in C divided by the change in Y. All right, so what are we doing on this graph? How are we connecting all this together on a graph? So on the graph, we put y on the horizontal axis. Now I'm going to keep saying this. Remember what y is. Y is three things at once. Y is total spending in society. Y is the total income in society. Y is the total production in society. So I'm really thinking about all three of these when I draw this horizontal axis. This is the total spending, or it's the total income or total production in a society. But let's think about specifically income right now. And then on the horizontal axis, we have the total consumption in society. And what we find is there's a positive relationship between income and consumption. That is to say that when income goes up, consumption goes up. And so we have a upward sloping consumption function. When y goes up, consumption goes up. When y goes up on the horizontal axis, consumption goes up on the vertical axis. And then we have this kind of weird spot down here, the vertical intercept right there. What does that vertical intercept mean? Well, what that means is that's the level of consumption that happens when income is right here at 0. So even if income is at 0, there is still some consumption that occurs, maybe through borrowing, maybe through depleting your savings in order to buy stuff. So there's some consumption level that happens even at 0 income, and then off of that we get the relationship between consumption and income. And that relationship, the slope of that curve, is really just the marginal propensity to consume. Because remember that slope in math is the rise over the run, and in this case the rise is the change in consumption, that's the variable here on the vertical axis, and the run is the change in income, which is down here on the horizontal axis. And so really that is the slope, the change in consumption divided by the change in y. So if y goes up by this much, consumption goes up by this much. Or say that the other way around. If consumption goes up by this much, then y goes up by that much. Whichever way you want to think about it, that's the slope, which is also the marginal propensity to consume. So the slope of this graph is the marginal propensity to consume. The slope of this graph is the marginal propensity to consume. Okay? So this is the relationship between GDP and consumption. Now, that would be if my formula were just y equals c. But that's not true. Our formula is really going to be y equals c plus ig. Okay, so what that means is if we add gross investment to this, that's just going to cause the whole curve to go up by the amount of the gross investment. Okay, sorry, I'm not sure if you can read this over here. Let me just move this over. Right there. So this is now called aggregate expenditures or total spending. Okay, so this is aggregate expenditures or total spending because, okay, so what's happening here is we had the consumption graph. Okay, and the slope of that is the marginal propensity to consume. Now, we didn't change the marginal propensity to consume, but we added some additional spending. So the additional spending or the additional expenditures, that just causes this whole curve to go up by the amount of gross investment. So this was the consumption function, and now this is what we're going to call aggregate expenditures. Okay, so y is equal to C plus IG, and IG, sorry, that's a little sloppy, and I plus G is what we call aggregate expenditures. It's the total spending in society. So we could pick any level of gross domestic product. We could say if the gross domestic product is right here, then the total spending in society, we would go to right here and come over, and that would be your total spending in society. So I have here consumption up here. I really shouldn't. This is really used to be consumption, but now it's consumption plus gross investment, which is really just the aggregate expenditures. Okay? So in other words, what we're doing is we are graphing the level of income and the amount of total spending in society. That's what we're trying to capture on the graph. Okay, hope that made some sense. We'll spend a lot more time on this graph on future videos. So if you're not quite seeing the relationship right now, we will spend a lot of time on this on future podcasts. This has been Mr. Hagan again on another Econ podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.